If you are a feminist in India, you have probably been asked, what are you still fighting for? India today guarantees women full and equal rights as citizens. Women can vote, they can study, they can work, they can own property. What's left? Well, Indian women can stand for elections, but somehow they don't win them. Only 12% of our current MPs are women. Women can study, but very few of them make it to the very top. In IITs, only 18% of students are women. Women have the right to work, but only 20% of them are in the workforce. That ratio, by the way, is worse than Afghanistan. And even though women can own property, only 2% of India's agricultural land actually belongs to them. So, if our laws guarantee Indian women all these rights, why is the reality of being a woman in India still so unequal? Almost like they're second-class citizens. What makes this situation even more strange is that the brand of politics that is currently dominant in India insists that the nation must be seen as a woman. And not just any woman, a goddess who embodies India's culture and traditions, Bharat Mata. Why then is the Indian woman, who is so central to the idea of this great Indian nation, so subservient to its men? Well, let's get into some history. Let's go back to the beginning of the 19th century. The British had colonized most of India by then. One of their many justifications for this colonization was the barbaric treatment of Indian women. Women were commonly married off as children and treated almost like slaves. And if their husbands died, they were either burnt alive or forced to live miserable, tortured lives as widows. Now, what the British really wanted was to exploit India's resources and labor, but pretending that they were ruling India because Indians didn't know how to govern themselves humanely was a convenient story, and it made their exploitation look like it was a good thing. At the time, there were a bunch of newly set up English schools, and a few rich upper caste Hindu men got a taste through them for Western culture and values. These men made up the new Indian middle class and were the self-appointed representatives of the rest of India. Go watch our video on them if you haven't yet. These men dressed in suits and boots and really wanted to fit into British high society. But no matter how fancy their clothes were, they couldn't scrub off the taint of these backward practices. So in the early 1800s, these men began campaigning to reform Indian society. They abolished sati, legalized widow remarriage, and there was even some talk of allowing women to be educated. Basically, they wanted to show the British that they could be modern too, and so could be trusted with more political power. Now, to be clear, these backward practices that were being reformed were mostly confined to a small minority of the population, upper caste Hindus, whose ideas of caste purity and honor shaped their patriarchy. But the British constantly assumed that upper caste ideas and concepts applied to all of Indian society, because their Brahmin advisors told them so. All of this social reform was interrupted in 1857 when the mutiny happened. After the fighting, British governance became much more rigid and centralized. India now had an empress, and the English-educated upper caste men found themselves even further away from political power. Social reform was suddenly less appealing to these men. They now wanted the British government to stay far away from what they were starting to see as internal matters. They started to see society as divided into two separate worlds. The material world, the world of political power, was one in which Indians were weak, subjugated. But the spiritual world, the world of culture and tradition, here they felt they were still superior to the British. This material-spiritual division mapped neatly onto a real physical division which was already present in Indian society. The home and the outside world. The outside world belonged to men, and the home, that was where women were confined. The home was where tradition and culture lived, and women looked after it. Now these cultures and traditions were seen as India's real identity. So the men who were outside in the public sphere represented India, but the source of their power and pride was what was inside the home. So in a way, these traditions and cultures were becoming the foundation for defining Indianness itself, and women were responsible for protecting and nurturing this. As long as that inner world of tradition and culture was safe from British interference, Indian men could still feel like they were in control, like they were independent. The idea that these traditions and cultures defined true Indianness came from the rising popularity of ancient Sanskrit texts such as the Manusmriti. The British had recently begun to translate, standardize, and publish these ancient works. These were essentially religious texts that were written and read only by certain castes, but British and Brahmin scholars used them as historical documents, manufacturing a twisted understanding of Indian society and history that somehow converted the massive, incredibly diverse subcontinent filled with innumerable different cultures, traditions, and ways of life into a single, solidly Hindu monolith. So, any deviations from this imagination of a glorious Hindu past that stretched back into ancient times, things like Buddhism, indigenous tribal culture, Islamic rule, British colonialism, all of these were treated as exceptions or interruptions. Upper caste reformers felt that these values from this lost past could be the foundation of a new India. But remember, these men also want to be seen as modern, so this idea of India they were developing had to balance both ancient culture and modern values. And women, as the literal embodiment of what it means to be Indian, had to do the same as well. Essentially, these upper caste male reformers wanted the new Indian woman to be modern enough so the British couldn't criticize them, but traditional enough that male dominance and power wasn't affected. In the process, women gained some limited freedom. For example, they could be educated. Not so they could get a job, that's still the domain of men. Rather, education was to give women all the training and skills necessary to run the home better, to be better wives and mothers. They're even allowed to go out and be a part of the public sphere for the first time, but only as long as they conveyed through their dress and their behavior and their social habits that they still preserved and protected all the traditions that these men drew their power from. This enabled women to participate in the freedom movement. The women who embodied the nation were now marching for the nation. The basic idea was that this new Indian woman was better than the traditional Indian woman who was not modern enough, but she was also better than the European woman who was too modern and competed with men. And of course, lower caste women were never even in the competition. This is a new form of patriarchy that these men were inventing. And this new patriarchy had a brand ambassador, Bharat Mata. Strong and fierce, but also defined by good traditional feminine qualities like sacrifice and devotion that connect her to the past. By the time the 20th century rolls around, this process of creating a new Indian woman and a new India is more or less complete. The upper caste social reformers, who now call themselves nationalists, have begun to demand increased political power, self-rule, from the British. But towards the end of the 1920s, the Indian nationalist cause faced a huge test when an American quote-unquote journalist named Catherine Mayo wrote a book called Mother India. The book was all about the horrors of being a child bride in India, and it was an instant international controversy. The book threatened the Indian argument for self-rule because once again the whole world was reminded of the backwardness of Indian society. The nationalist men were furious at the book. They called it racist imperialist propaganda. But the biggest response against the book came from Indian women's organizations, who not only criticized it, but also organized a massive political campaign to raise the age of consent for marriage and to make child marriage a criminal offense. Eventually, this led to the passing of the Child Marriage Restraint Act in 1929. This was a massive victory for the nationalists. It showed India's women as being capable and independent, and thus killed the criticism arising from Mayo's book. But although the nationalist men were happy that India came out looking good, many hated that the new law restricted the total authority that they previously had over their daughters. The British government was also worried about exactly this, that the law might upset India's mostly conservative population. So they quietly ordered their officials to not implement the law at all, and nationalist leaders were happy to turn a blind eye. By this point, Indians had some representation in the central assemblies, and the nationalist leaders were focused on using this new political power for social reforms again. But they had a new target, the Hindu joint family. In the joint family setup, the patriarch, the eldest male, was in control of the family's entire wealth and property. Younger men, like the many lawyers who led the nationalist movement, had no control even over the income from their own jobs. So, from the 1920s onwards, they passed a series of laws that gave themselves more power over wealth and property in the family. But what's interesting is that these laws were often argued on the basis of women's rights. The reforms did theoretically expand women's rights to property, but crucially, they did so only in their position as wives or widows. So essentially, women kept being empowered by giving more and more power to their husbands. And this really points to the fundamental flaw in the Indian nationalist attempts to reform the role of women. The nationalist leaders learned to speak the language of women's rights and cleverly used it for various purposes over the years, for creating the idea of a nation, for inspiring people to fight for it, and even for increasing the power of men. But they mostly opposed any measures that granted real gender equality. Even after independence, when India's new constitution made women formally equal to men, very little changed. In the 1950s, Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar proposed the Hindu Code Bill, which would radically alter women's rights in aspects such as marriage, inheritance, and property. But the bill faced such strong opposition from upper caste Hindu MPs that Ambedkar resigned from his post as law minister in disgust. Jawaharlal Nehru then severely watered down the proposal and managed to get it passed. And in independent India, Bharat Mata remained as popular as before because she was still useful. For what? Well, if you read the news, you'll see that she's mostly invoked by mobs of angry men to justify beating up Muslims and other minorities. And so when you think about it, it's obvious that Bharat Mata isn't an Indian goddess. I mean, can a Christian woman be Bharat Mata, a Muslim woman, a lower caste woman? The only group that's really eligible is upper caste Hindu women, and that too upper caste Hindu women who remain within the boundaries of religious and caste traditions that empower men. So even though Indian women have got formal equality and rights, and most men find it hard to question any of that in public, women have to remain within an invisible boundary if they want to be eligible for any respect. So basically, you can be outspoken and confident as long as you marry within your caste. You can be independent and have a job as long as you come back and figure out dinner for your family. You can have your hopes and dreams as long as they are subordinate to your husband and your children. Basically, in a million small, everyday ways, women are reminded that they're second-class citizens in this motherland that we call India.